The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched like a metal canyon before Ambassador Hyunwoo as he walked toward the speaker platform. His black diplomatic uniform felt heavy on his shoulders, and each step echoed in the vast chamber filled with alien representatives from across the galaxy. The air hummed with translation devices working to convert thousands of different languages into something everyone could understand. Hyunwoo had been coming to these meetings for 15 years. He knew every face in the room and most of their stories. The blue-skinned Aquarians who breathed water and lived in floating cities. The rock-like Vorthok who built their empire on conquest and strength. The tall silver Nexari who calculated everything like a math problem before making decisions. There were hundreds of other species too, with names he could barely pronounce and customs that still amazed him. But today felt different. The usual chatter before meetings had been replaced by cold silence. Eyes that once greeted him with friendship now looked away. Even species that humans had helped for decades seemed uncomfortable when he passed by their seats. Counselor Thexmar of the Vorthak Empire stood at the central podium. His gray stone skin gleamed under the bright lights, and his forearms crossed, in what humans had learned was a sign of authority among his people. When he spoke, his voice boomed across the chamber like rocks falling down a mountain. The Council has reached a decision regarding human activities in galactic space, Thexmar announced. For too long, humanity has interfered in affairs that do not concern them. They send ships where they are not invited. They offer help that was not requested. They act as if they own the galaxy. Hyunwoo felt his stomach tighten, but kept his face calm. Around him, other human diplomats shifted in their seats. There were only 12 humans in a chamber of over 3,000 beings, but somehow they had always made their voices heard. Humans build hospitals on worlds that belong to other species, continued another voice. This time, it was Counselor Veltar from the Nexari Collective. Her silver face showed no emotion as she read from a data tablet. They share technology without permission from local governments. Their exploration ships map territories in neutral space, as if they have the right to do so. More voices joined in. The Calorian representative complained about human agricultural experts who had helped end a famine on their world without asking the government first. A delegate from the Trill Federation said human peacekeepers had stopped a civil war that should have been allowed to continue until one side won properly. Each complaint hit Hyunwoo like a physical blow. These were not crimes they were describing. These were acts of kindness. When the Calorians were starving, human ships had arrived with food and seeds and knowledge of how to grow crops in poor soil. When the Trill were killing each other over ancient grudges, human diplomats had sat with both sides for months finding ways they could share their world in peace. Humanity acts as if they are the parents of the galaxy, Thexmar said with disgust. They treat all other species like children, who cannot solve their own problems. This insults every member of this council. The accusations went on for over an hour. Humans were called manipulators who used kindness to gain power. They were described as dangerous because they refused to follow the normal rules of galactic politics, where strong species dominated weak ones. Some delegates even suggested that human generosity was a form of warfare, designed to make other species dependent on Earth. Finally, Thexmar raised all four arms for silence. The chamber went quiet except for the soft hum of life support systems and translation devices. Therefore, the Galactic Council hereby demands that humanity cease all unauthorized activities beyond their home system. All human aid missions will stop immediately. All human research stations in neutral space will be abandoned. All human exploration beyond the Sol system will require Council approval. He paused to let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. Humanity has 30 standard days to comply with these demands. Any human ships found operating outside their home system after that time will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. The threat was clear. Follow our rules or face the combined military might of the galaxy. Hyunwoo looked around the chamber and saw no friendly faces. Even species that owed their survival to human help sat silently. Fear of the major powers had made them abandon their friends. When Thexmar finished speaking, the chamber erupted in discussion. Delegates from various species began debating the details of how to enforce these new rules. Some suggested inspection, teams to monitor human space. Others wanted economic sanctions to make sure Earth could not support any secret missions. Through all of this, Hyun-woo stood quietly at the human delegation table. His colleagues looked at him expecting him to respond with anger or demands for a vote or threats of retaliation. That was how galactic politics normally worked. When one side pushed, the other side pushed back harder. But Hyun-woo had been thinking about something his grandmother used to tell him when he was young. She had survived the wars on Earth before humanity reached the stars, and she always said that the strongest response to hatred was not more hatred, but understanding. Even when others treated you badly, you should try to see why they felt that way. Looking at the angry alien faces around him, Hyun-woo began to understand. These beings had built their civilizations on competition and conflict. To them, power meant the ability to force others to do what you wanted. They had never learned that sometimes the greatest strength came from helping others become stronger too. When the chamber finally quieted down, Thexmar looked directly at the human delegation. Does humanity have anything to say about these terms? Hyun-woo stood slowly and walked to the speaking platform. The walk felt longer than usual, and he could feel thousands of eyes watching his every move. When he reached the microphone, he looked out at the sea of alien faces and felt sadness more than anger. Honorable counselors, he began in a voice that carried clearly through the translation systems. When humanity first reached the stars, we came with hope. We dreamed of meeting new friends and learning from species wiser than ourselves. We wanted to explore the galaxy together and build something beautiful. He paused and saw some delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. This was not the angry response they had expected. We have tried to be good neighbors, Hyun-woo continued. When we saw suffering, we offered help. When we found new worlds, we shared the coordinates. When conflicts arose, we offered to mediate. We did these things not to gain power over others, but because we believed that intelligence was precious wherever it appeared. The chamber was completely silent now. Even the usual background noise of shuffling and whispering had stopped. But we understand now that our actions have been misinterpreted. You see manipulation where we intended friendship. You see threats where we offered assistance. If the Council believes that humanity's presence in galactic affairs causes more harm than good, then we will respect that decision. Hyun-woo looked directly at Thexmar as he spoke his final words. Humanity will comply with the Council's demands. We will withdraw from all activities beyond our home system. You have asked for our absence, and you will have it. With that, he turned and walked back to his seat. The human delegation gathered their materials in silence and began filing out of the chamber. No protests, no demands for reconsideration, no threats of retaliation. The alien delegates watched in confusion as the humans left quietly. This was not how galactic politics was supposed to work. There should have been arguments and negotiations and angry speeches. Instead, there was only the soft sound of footsteps as humanity walked away from the galaxy that no longer wanted them. Captain Ji-hoon stared at the message on his command screen and felt his heart sink. The encrypted transmission from Earth Command was short and clear, but the words seemed impossible to believe. All human vessels were ordered to return to Sol system immediately. All aid missions were to be terminated. All research projects were to be abandoned. He looked up from his screen to see the blue and green world of Kepler 442c spinning slowly outside the bridge windows. Down on that planet's surface, 2 billion Trillani were dying from a plague that attacked their nervous systems. His medical team had been working for 6 months to develop a cure, and they were so close to success. Captain called Dr. So Young from her station at the medical console. The latest test results show we've almost cracked the protein structure. Another week and we'll have a working vaccine. Ji-hoon closed his eyes and tried to think of what to say. How do you explain to someone that politics matter more than saving lives? How do you tell your crew that they have to walk away from people who desperately need help? Doctor, please come to my ready room, he said quietly. So Young followed him into the small office behind the bridge. She was young for a chief medical officer, but brilliant in ways that amazed him every day. Her black hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and her uniform showed stains from long hours in the medical labs. We're leaving, Ji-hoon said without ceremony. Leaving where? So Young asked with confusion. Leaving here. Leaving them. Ji-hoon gestured toward the planet below. Earth Command has ordered all human ships to withdraw from galactic space immediately. So-young stared at him for several seconds before the words sank in. But Captain, they'll die. All of them. Without the vaccine, the plague will spread to every continent within months. I know. We can't just abandon them. These people trusted us. They opened their world to us because we promised to help. I know. So-young began pacing around the small room. What about the Galactic Council? Can't they send medical teams from other species? Ji-hoon pulled up the latest intelligence reports on his desk screen. The Vorthak Medical Corps uses treatments based on their rock-like biology. Nothing they have works on organic neural systems. The Nexari focus on cybernetic solutions that would require replacing half of each patient's brain. The Aquarians can't even survive on dry land. Then we stay, So-young said firmly. We finish the job and deal with the consequences later. No, Ji-hoon replied. We follow orders. The same conversation was happening on human ships throughout the galaxy. Engineer Dong-min received the recall order while installing fusion reactors on the ice world of Tethys Prime. The colonial settlement there would face winter temperatures of -200 degrees without reliable power. He had promised the colonists that their new reactors would be online before the storms came. Sir, his assistant Kang Ho said as they read the message together. These people will freeze to death without power. Dongmin looked out at the construction site where alien workers were preparing to install the fusion cores he had designed specifically for their world's harsh conditions. Pack it up, he said. We're going home. On the edge of the void, Nebula xenobiologist Hei-wan was studying organisms that might hold the key to terraforming dead worlds. Her research station had been monitoring the nebula for 15 years, and her data showed concerning changes in its expansion rate. But the recall order was absolute. She began downloading her files onto portable drives while watching her automated probes disappear into the dark clouds of space dust. Across the galaxy, human ships began powering down their systems and preparing for departure. Aid stations that had operated for decades went dark. Research facilities that had made breakthrough discoveries were abandoned. Diplomatic missions that had prevented wars were quietly closed. The aliens watched in confusion as humans packed their equipment with careful efficiency. There were no emotional outbursts or dramatic speeches. The humans simply followed their orders with the same quiet competence they brought to everything else. On Kepler 442c, the Trilani government sent desperate messages to Captain Ji-hoon's ship begging him to stay just a few more days. Please, transmitted Prime Minister Kelthera. Our children are dying in the hospitals. You are so close to finding a cure. Ji-hoon composed his response carefully. Prime Minister, I regret that. Circumstances beyond our control require our immediate departure. We have transmitted all of our research data to your medical teams. Perhaps they will be able to continue where we left off. But both of them knew that Trilani science was centuries behind human biotechnology. Without human expertise, the research data might as well have been written in ancient poetry. Similar scenes played out on hundreds of worlds. Human doctors uploaded their medical knowledge to local computers, knowing that most species lacked the technology to use it effectively. Human engineers left detailed instruction manuals for equipment that required materials not available on those worlds. Human diplomats tried to explain complex peace agreements to species that had never learned to compromise. The withdrawal was not just about ships and people. Humanity had quietly become the nervous system of galactic civilization. They had mapped safe routes through dangerous regions of space. They had established communication relays that allowed distant species to talk to each other. They had created trade networks that brought prosperity to worlds that had never known it before. All of this infrastructure began shutting down as human personnel followed their orders to return home. Navigation beacons went silent. Communication arrays powered off. Supply depots locked their doors and activated automated defense systems. On the water world of Aquaria Prime, the human embassy began packing diplomatic files that contained 30 years of careful relationship building. Ambassador Minju had spent her entire career learning to communicate with the water-breathing Aquarians. She understood their complex social hierarchies and had helped negotiate treaties that prevented 3 separate wars. Ambassador gurgled the Aquarian foreign minister through his translation device. Surely you can stay until we find a replacement diplomat who understands our ways. Minju looked at the alien's tentacled face and saw genuine fear there. Without human mediation, the Aquarians knew they would return to their old pattern of conflict with neighboring species. I am sorry, Minister, but my government has made its decision. Perhaps the Galactic Council will assign new mediators. Both of them knew that other species had tried and failed to understand Aquarian culture. The complex system of honor and obligation that governed their society made little sense to beings who had evolved on dry land. As news of the human withdrawal spread, panic began to set in on worlds that had grown dependent on human help. The farming colonies that relied on human agricultural experts faced the prospect of failed harvests. The mining worlds that used human-designed equipment watched their production systems slow to a halt as replacement parts became unavailable. Trade routes that had been safe for decades suddenly became dangerous as human patrol ships disappeared. Pirates and raiders who had avoided areas with human presence began testing the new situation. Merchant vessels that had relied on human navigation data found themselves lost in regions of space that humans had carefully mapped, but other species had never bothered to explore. The economic impact rippled through the galactic community like waves from a dropped stone. Species that had prospered from trade with human colonies watched their markets collapse overnight. Banks that had invested in human-backed projects faced massive losses as entire economic sectors disappeared. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the withdrawal was how quietly it happened. Humans did not complain or argue or demand explanations. They simply followed their orders with the same calm efficiency they had always shown. When asked why they were leaving, they gave polite responses about respecting the Council's decision. This dignified retreat somehow made the situation worse. If humans had left in anger, it would have been easier to dismiss them as emotional and unpredictable. If they had threatened retaliation, it would have confirmed that they were dangerous. Instead, they left with grace and understanding, which made their absence feel even more ominous. As the last human ships departed their assigned sectors, a strange quiet settled over the galaxy. For the first time in decades, there were no human voices offering help or suggesting solutions or mediating disputes. The galactic community that had demanded independence from human interference was about to learn what that independence actually meant. 3 months after the humans left, the first emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in chaos. Representatives shouted over each other in dozens of languages, while translation devices struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations. The great chamber that had seemed so orderly during the ultimatum now buzzed with panic and confusion. Councillor Thexmar pounded his stone fists on the podium trying to restore order. His gray face showed cracks of stress that had not been there when he delivered humanity's expulsion order. The council will come to order, he boomed, but his voice lacked its former confidence. The first speaker was Prime Minister Kelthara of the Trelawney from Kepler 442c. Her blue-scaled face appeared on the main communication screen looking exhausted and desperate. Behind her, the sounds of chaos echoed through what had once been a peaceful world. Honorable councillors, she began with a voice that trembled. I come before you to beg for medical assistance. The plague that human doctors were treating has mutated. It now spreads through the air instead of just through contact. Entire cities have gone silent. Our own medical teams cannot develop treatments fast enough. Murmurs of concern rippled through the chamber. Several species had dealt with the Trelawney plague before and knew how devastating it could become without proper intervention. The Vorthak Empire offers immediate medical assistance, announced Councillor Thexmar with forced authority. Our medical corps will deploy to Kepler 442c within 10 days. But when the Vorthak medical team arrived, they found themselves completely unprepared for what they encountered. Their treatments were designed for silicon-based life forms like themselves. The organic neural systems of the Trelawney might as well have been alien technology for all the good Vorthak medicine could do. Dr. Kethvak led the medical team with the best intentions, but his rock-like hands were too clumsy to handle the delicate instruments needed for organic surgery. His people's immunity to biological diseases meant they had never developed the specialized knowledge needed to fight viral infections in carbon-based life forms. Within days, it became clear that the Vorthak medical mission was a disaster. There, treatments actually made the plague worse by triggering immune responses that the Trilani bodies could not handle. Patients who might have survived with no treatment at all died within hours of receiving Vorthak care. The news spread quickly through galactic communication networks. If the mighty Vorthak Empire could not handle a simple medical crisis, what hope did smaller species have when emergencies struck their worlds? On Tethys Prime, the situation was growing equally desperate. Colonial Administrator Zechthel watched. The power readings dropped steadily as their old fusion reactor finally gave up completely. The colonists had tried to restart the new human-designed reactors, but the technology was beyond their understanding. The instruction manuals that engineer Dongmin had left behind were detailed and complete, but they assumed knowledge that the colonists did not possess. References to quantum field stabilizers and plasma injection systems might as well have been ancient magic spells. "We need to evacuate the colony," Zechthel announced during an emergency meeting. "Without power, we cannot survive the winter storms." But evacuation was easier said than done. Tethys Prime was located in a remote region of space that few ships visited. The nearest inhabited world was months away by conventional travel, and the colony's communication systems were failing as their power reserves drained. The colonists faced a terrible choice. They could try to build primitive heating systems using whatever materials they could scavenge, but those would only delay the inevitable. Or they could attempt to repair the fusion reactors themselves and risk destroying what little power they had left. Meanwhile, trade routes throughout the galaxy began experiencing unprecedented problems. Merchant Captain Velkaris of the Nexari Collective had been using the same hyperspace route for 20 years. It was a path that human explorers had mapped decades ago and marked as safe for regular travel. But when Velkaris emerged from hyperspace at his usual coordinates, he found himself inside a massive gravitational anomaly that his sensors had never detected before. His ship was pulled off course and damaged before he could escape to normal space. "This is impossible," he transmitted to traffic control at the nearest station. "This route has been safe for decades. There should be no gravitational disturbances in this sector." The response he received was disturbing. "Captain, human navigation services are no longer available. We recommend you update your star charts using current scan data." But updating star charts was a complex process that required specialized equipment and expertise that most merchant vessels did not possess. Human ships had quietly maintained the navigation networks that allowed safe travel throughout the galaxy. Without them, space travel became a dangerous gamble. Ship after ship began reporting problems, gravitational anomalies that appeared without warning, solar storms that erupted along previously safe routes, spatial rifts that opened in regions that had been stable for generations. The Nexari Collective lost 12 merchant vessels in the first month alone. Each ship carried valuable cargo and experienced crews that could not be easily replaced. Insurance companies began raising their rates to impossible levels as the risks of space travel skyrocketed. Economic disruption followed close behind the navigation problems. Species that had grown wealthy from trade with distant worlds watched their prosperity evaporate as shipping costs became prohibitive. Markets that had been stable for decades collapsed as supply chains broke down. On the agricultural world of Cerealis, the harvest season arrived without the human experts who had taught local farmers how to maximize their crop yields. The techniques that humans had developed specifically for Cerealis soil conditions were complex and required precise timing. Farmer Threkus looked at his withering grain fields and felt despair settling over him like a dark cloud. "The humans showed us how to increase our yields by 300%, he explained to his workers. "But I cannot remember all the steps. The soil treatment must be done at exactly the right time or the crops will fail. Without human guidance, the harvest on Cerealis failed completely. Millions of tons of grain that should have fed dozens of worlds rotted in the fields. Famine began spreading through the agricultural colonies as food supplies dwindled. But perhaps the most alarming development was happening on the borders of known space. The Void Nebula had been slowly expanding for centuries, but human scientist Haiwan's monitoring stations had kept track of its growth and predicted its movements. Her early warning systems had allowed space traffic to avoid the nebula's path and given colonies time to evacuate when necessary. Her research had also revealed that the nebula was not just a natural phenomenon, but something far more dangerous. Without human monitoring, the nebula's expansion accelerated dramatically. Worlds that should have been safe for years found themselves in its path with no advance warning. The first sign of danger was usually the complete loss of communication, as the nebula consumed everything in its path. The mining colony on asteroid station Omega-7 simply disappeared one day. Their last transmission was a routine status report and then silence. When rescue ships arrived, they found nothing but empty space where a thriving community had existed for 50 years. Emergency council sessions became daily occurrences as crisis after crisis demanded attention. Species that had been enemies for generations found themselves working together out of sheer desperation. The Aquarians and the desert-dwelling Zerani began sharing resources, despite their completely incompatible biologies. "We need to contact the humans," declared Councillor Veltar during one particularly heated session. "Whatever our differences, we cannot handle these problems without their expertise." But Councillor Thexmar refused to consider such a proposal. "We cannot appear weak by crawling back to them after ordering their expulsion. The galaxy will lose all respect for this council if we admit we were wrong." "What galaxy will be left to respect us?" shouted Prime Minister Kelthera from her plague-stricken world. "My people are dying. Entire species are going extinct. Trade has collapsed. Space travel is becoming impossible. How much worse must things get before we admit we made a mistake?" The argument that followed revealed just how desperate the situation had become. Species that had supported the human expulsion now blamed each other for the consequences. The unity that had existed during the ultimatum crumbled as each civilization struggled to survive on its own. Through it all, the humans remained silent. Messages sent to Sol System received no response. Diplomatic channels that had been open for decades were suddenly closed. It was as if humanity had vanished from the galaxy entirely, leaving behind only the growing list of problems that their absence had created. The first cracks in galactic civilization had appeared, and they were spreading faster than anyone had imagined possible. The council that had demanded independence from human interference was learning that some forms of help could not be easily replaced. By the 6th month after the human departure, the galaxy was hemorrhaging civilization itself. What had begun as isolated problems had grown into a cascade of disasters that threatened the very foundations of galactic society. The Andromedan plague, that had been contained for 30 years, suddenly erupted across 17 star systems simultaneously. The disease was unlike anything most species had encountered before. It attacked not just biological systems, but also cybernetic implants and even some forms of artificial intelligence. Dr. Vorthek of the Nexari Medical Corps stared at the latest outbreak reports with growing horror. "This makes no sense," he transmitted to his colleagues across the galaxy. "The plague should not be able to spread this quickly or affect so many different types of life forms." What Dr. Vorthek did not know was that human medical teams had been quietly maintaining a network of monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. These stations had detected early signs of plague mutations and dispatched treatment teams before outbreaks could spread. They had also developed vaccines that worked across multiple species by targeting the underlying quantum structures that all life forms shared. Without human intervention, the Andromedan plague was free to evolve and adapt. Each new world it infected provided opportunities for the disease to develop new abilities. What had once been a manageable threat was becoming a galactic extinction event. On the industrial world of Pharos Prime, the plague infected not just the organic population, but also the artificial intelligences that controlled their manufacturing systems. Automated factories began producing random objects instead of useful goods. Transportation networks shut down as their control systems became corrupted. Power grids failed as infected maintenance robots began dismantling the very infrastructure they were designed to protect. The Pharosian government sent desperate pleas for help to every species in the galaxy, but no one had experience dealing with a plague that could infect both biological and artificial systems. The world that had once been the manufacturing center of 3 sectors became a quarantine zone where nothing functioned properly. Even more disturbing were the political consequences of humanity's absence. The peace accords between the feuding Cathani clans had been carefully mediated by human diplomat Sang-Ho over a period of 5 years. The agreement was complex and required constant maintenance as circumstances changed. Without Sang-Ho's patient guidance, the Cathani peace began to unravel within weeks. Old grievances that had been addressed in the accords were reinterpreted by clan leaders who remembered different versions of the negotiations. Territorial boundaries that had been clearly defined became subjects of new disputes. The humans promised access to the crystal mines, declared clan leader Vorthak during a heated council meeting. But they gave mining rights to our enemies instead. That is not what the accords say, responded clan leader Kelthera. The mining rights were to be shared between all clans according to population ratios. But without human records and human interpreters, there was no way to verify what the original agreements actually contained. Each clan had kept their own records, and each version was slightly different. What had been a carefully balanced peace agreement became fuel for new conflicts. Within months, the Cathani homeworld erupted in civil war. Weapons that had been put away for decades were taken out of storage. Cities that had grown prosperous during peacetime were reduced to rubble as ancient hatreds flared to life again. The violence spread beyond the Cathani system as other species took sides in the conflict. Trade alliances that had been built over generations collapsed as worlds chose between supporting different Cathani factions. What had begun as a local dispute became a regional war that threatened to engulf entire sectors. But the most terrifying development was happening at the edge of known space. The Void Nebula was no longer just expanding randomly, but seemed to be actively hunting for inhabited systems. Dr. Haywan's abandoned research station had been the only facility monitoring the nebula's true nature. Her classified reports revealed that the Void Nebula was not a natural phenomenon, but a form of collective intelligence that consumed matter and energy to fuel its growth. The nebula could sense electromagnetic emissions from advanced civilizations and deliberately moved to intercept them. Human containment fields had been keeping the nebula dormant for decades by masking the energy signatures of nearby star systems. Without those fields, the nebula was waking up and beginning to hunt again. The first sign of the nebula's new behavior came when the industrial system of Gamma Centauri simply vanished overnight. Long-range sensors detected massive gravitational disturbances and then nothing. When scout ships arrived at the system's coordinates, they found only empty space and a slowly expanding cloud of dark matter. "This is impossible," reported Captain Zelvek of the Nexari Exploration Corps. "Entire star systems do not just disappear. There must be some natural explanation." But as more systems vanished, the pattern became undeniable. The Void Nebula was actively seeking out and consuming advanced civilizations. It was learning to recognize the signs of intelligent life and adapting its movement patterns to intercept them more efficiently. Panic spread through the galactic community as the true scope of the threat became clear. Species that had never cooperated began sharing resources and information in desperate attempts to understand what they were facing. But without human expertise in xenobiology and quantum physics, their efforts were largely useless. The Aquarian Federation attempted to establish new research stations to monitor the nebula, but their water-based technology could not function in the vacuum of space near the phenomenon. The Vorthak Empire sent military fleets to attack the nebula directly, but their weapons simply disappeared into the dark clouds without any visible effect. Meanwhile, the economic collapse that had begun with transportation problems accelerated into a full-scale depression. Currency systems that had been stable for centuries became worthless overnight as trade networks broke down completely. Worlds that had specialized in producing specific goods found themselves unable to obtain the raw materials they needed from other systems. The technological regression was equally devastating. Many species had become dependent on human innovations without fully understanding the principles behind them. Medical equipment designed by humans began breaking down without proper maintenance. Communication systems that relied on human-developed protocols began experiencing failures as their quantum encryption keys expired. On the scientific research world of Academy Prime, the greatest minds from dozens of species gathered to try to solve the mounting crises. But their meeting quickly devolved into arguments and finger-pointing, as each group blamed the others for their shared predicament. If the Vorthak had not insisted on expelling the humans, we would still have their medical expertise, accused Professor Kelthera of the Trilani Institute. The humans were manipulating us all, replied Dr. Vorthak of the Vorthak Science Corps. Their so-called help made us weak and dependent. Weak and dependent or not, at least we were alive, shouted Professor Zeltek of the Nexari Academy. Now, we are independent and dying. The debates raged for days without producing any useful solutions. The assembled scientists could not even agree on how to approach the various problems, let alone how to solve them. Each species had developed their own scientific methods and theories that were incompatible with the approaches used by others. What became increasingly clear was that humans had served as more than just helpers or mediators. They had been the connective tissue that held galactic civilization together. Their ability to understand and work with dozens of different species had allowed them to translate not just languages, but entire ways of thinking. Without human bridges between different forms of intelligence, the galaxy was fragmenting into isolated groups that could barely communicate with each other. The Aquarians could not understand why the desert dwellers were obsessed with conserving water. The silicon-based Vorthak could not grasp why organic species feared genetic modification. The cybernetic Nexari could not comprehend why biological species made decisions based on emotions rather than pure logic. As the 6th month ended and the 7th began, even the most stubborn council members were beginning to admit privately that they had made a terrible mistake. But admitting error publicly would mean accepting responsibility for the disasters that were consuming the galaxy. The question was no longer whether they needed the humans back, but whether humanity would even want to return to a galaxy that had rejected their friendship and was now falling apart without their help. 1 year after delivering the ultimatum that expelled humanity from galactic space, Counselor Thexmar stood alone in his private chambers, staring at tactical displays that showed the galaxy's dying light. Red zones marked plague-stricken worlds, where entire species faced extinction. Black voids indicated star systems that had been consumed by the expanding void nebula. Yellow warnings highlighted trade routes that had become too dangerous to navigate. The proud Vorthak Empire that had led the charge against human interference was crumbling along with everyone else. 3 of their major industrial worlds had fallen to the Andromedan plague. Their military fleets were stranded in distant sectors as navigation systems failed and supply lines collapsed. Even their home world was showing signs of social breakdown, as economic refugees from failed colonies overwhelmed their cities. Thexmar's 4 stone arms hung limp at his sides as he read the latest disaster reports. The Trilani of Kepler 442c had gone completely silent 2 months ago. The last transmission from their world had been a children's choir singing ancient songs of their people as the plague claimed the final survivors. An entire civilization of 2 billion beings had been erased because the galaxy's greatest medical experts had been ordered to leave them behind. A soft chime announced an incoming transmission. Thexmar almost ignored it, assuming it would be another desperate plea for help from some dying world. But the origin code was different from anything he had seen in months. The message was coming from Sol System. The holographic display shimmered to life, showing a human figure that Thexmar did not recognize. She was a middle-aged woman with kind but tired eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple style. Her uniform bore the insignia of what appeared to be a civilian administration, rather than the military or diplomatic corps. "Counselor Thexmar," she said, with a voice that carried no anger or accusation despite everything that had happened. "I am Director Min-Ah of the Human Colonial Administration. I hope this message finds you well." Thexmar's stone features could not show emotion, but his voice cracked slightly as he responded. "Director, I must admit I did not expect to hear from humanity again after our previous disagreement." Disagreement. Mina repeated with what might have been the ghost of a sad smile. Is that what we're calling it now? We've been monitoring. Galactic Communications Counselor, we're aware of the current situation. The understatement was so profound that it almost seemed cruel. The current situation included the extinction of multiple species, the collapse of galactic civilization, and threats that endangered every living being in known space. Director Thexmar began carefully. The Council has been reviewing certain policies regarding human activities in neutral space. There may be room for reconsideration of our previous position. It was as close to an apology as his pride would allow, but Mina seemed to understand the significance of even this small admission. We appreciate that, Counselor, she replied. However, the Council made its position quite clear 1 year ago. You wanted humanity gone from galactic affairs, and we respected that decision. But surely you must understand, Thexmar said with growing desperation in his voice. The situation has become critical. Species are dying. Entire civilizations are being lost. We need human expertise to address these crises. Mina was quiet for several seconds before responding. What we understand, Counselor, is that you saw our help as interference. Our generosity was interpreted as manipulation. Our presence was viewed as a threat to galactic independence. The holographic display shifted to show images from human space. Massive construction projects were transforming barren worlds into garden paradises. New technologies were being developed that seemed to defy known laws of physics. Thriving colonies stretched across hundreds of star systems that most galactic species had never even heard of. While the galaxy had been tearing itself apart, humanity had been building something magnificent in isolation. Their enforced withdrawal had freed them to focus entirely on their own advancement, and the results were staggering. You were partially right about us, Mina continued. Humans are exceptional. Not because we're superior to other species, but because we care about others even when they don't care about us in return. We're willing to sacrifice our own interests to help strangers. We spend resources on problems that aren't ours to solve. She paused, and her expression grew sadder. But respect must be mutual, Counselor. You cannot demand our help when you need it while rejecting our friendship when you don't. Thexmar felt something he had never experienced before in his long life. The stone-skinned Vorthak were not capable of weeping, but if they could, he would have done so at that moment. Director, what would it take for humanity to return? What price would you demand? Price. Mina shook her head slowly. This isn't about payment, Counselor. This is about understanding. For decades, humans served as the immune system of galactic civilization. We identified threats before they became disasters. We mediated conflicts before they became wars. We shared knowledge freely to lift up species that were struggling. The display showed more images from the human withdrawal. Dr. So Young's medical research that could have saved the Trilani. Engineered Dongmin's fusion reactors that could have powered 100 worlds. Diplomat Sang Ho's peace negotiations that had prevented countless wars. We didn't do these things to gain power over others, Mina explained. We did them because we believed that intelligence was precious wherever it appeared. Every species that achieved spaceflight represented millions of years of evolution and countless generations of dreams and struggles. We couldn't stand by and watch that be lost to preventable disasters. Thexmar understood now why the human withdrawal had been so devastating. It wasn't just that they had taken their technology and expertise with them. They had taken their perspective, their ability to see every species as valuable, rather than as competitors or resources. The irony, Mina continued, is that by forcing us to leave you proved our point about cooperation and mutual aid. Look what happened when the galaxy tried to function without collaboration. Look how quickly civilization collapsed when species stopped helping each other. She gestured to data streams showing the current state of galactic affairs. The Void Nebula had consumed 12 more star systems in the past month. The Andromedan plague was spreading faster than ever, as species hoarded what little medical knowledge they possessed. Trade wars had erupted between former allies as each civilization tried to secure resources for itself alone. But it doesn't have to continue this way, Mina said. The choice is yours, Counselor. You can keep trying to handle these problems through competition and conflict, or you can remember what it was like when different species worked together toward common goals. What are you proposing? Thexmar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Nothing, Minna replied. We're not proposing anything. We're not demanding anything. We're not negotiating for anything. We're simply observing from a distance and waiting to see what the galaxy decides for itself. The transmission showed human ships sitting in perfect formation at the edge of Sol system. Not weapons or threats, but rescue vessels, and medical ships and construction craft. They were waiting patiently like firefighters outside a burning building, whose owners had told them to stay away. If the galaxy truly wants to be independent, then we wish you well in that endeavor, Mina said. If individual species decide they would prefer cooperation and mutual aid, then our doors remain open to them. But we will not force our help on anyone who does not want it. The transmission was ending, but Thexmar had one final, desperate question. Director, what about the species that are dying right now? The Trilani children who never got the vaccine. The Cathani clans that have returned to war. The worlds that are being consumed by the Void Nebula. Minna's kind face showed deep sadness, but also resolve. Those tragedies break our hearts, counselor, but they are the consequences of choices that the galaxy made freely. We cannot save people who insist they do not need saving. As the hologram faded, Thexmar was left alone with the displays showing his dying galaxy. For the first time in his long life, he truly understood what humans had been trying to teach them all along. Civilization was not about who was strongest or smartest or most advanced. It was about choosing to care for each other, despite their differences. The galaxy had rejected that lesson and was now paying the price. Whether they would learn from their mistakes before it was too late remained to be seen. But humanity would be waiting patiently at the edge of known space, ready to help rebuild what could be saved, if anyone was finally ready to ask for their friendship rather than demand their subservience. Outside his window, another star flickered and died as the Void Nebula continued its relentless advance. The silence that humanity had left behind was not empty space, but the absence of hope itself.